Okay, so good afternoon to everyone who's joining us. It's my pleasure uh, to be welcoming everyone here to the continuing ongoing seminar series of the Department of Political Science at the University of São Paulo. And we're very, very excited to have Professor J.C. Wright with us from Northwestern Political Science Department, but also a member of the faculty of the IPSA USP Summer School in Concepts, Methods, and Techniques. We're going to be hearing a really interesting discussion today on pluralism in more radical terrain, and I'm going to turn over now to Jay.
Right, thank you. So one of the things that we know about social science and political science right now is that we're living in the era of pluralism. So I have a, sorry, to get us started, I have a kind of the beginning of a piece from, this is an essay that was in PS Political Science by Jim Farr a couple of years ago, where he says methodological pluralism. He starts this out, and he has a quote from Arthur Danto, philosopher. He says, "The age of pluralism is upon us. It does not matter any longer what you do," which is what pluralism is. So Farr is kind of making this wry point that political science doesn't have the relevance maybe that it once had anymore. But that's okay, because we all get along with each other and the methodological wars are over. We're all nice and friendly. You can be qualitative, you can be quantitative. It's all pluralism. This ethos of pluralism is really strong in our discipline now. The old days when we had perestroika and there were wars between rational choice and other people, or quantitative and qualitative, this is kind of in the past. And yet, there's a question I have. In this era of pluralism, do we still have fights and boundaries? What are the challenging frontiers? What are the things that people say, well, maybe, I'm not sure? And I'm going to suggest that there still are some. There are methodological areas where people say, I'm not sure, this worries me. And to make this point, I'm going to show you a couple of them. So, for example, my good friend John Gearing wrote an essay a couple years back where he tried to be really clever and do an interpretation of interpretivism, and says, well, what is interpretivism even? And through this entire essay, he offers 9 different theories of what interpretivism might be, and sort of says, there really isn't a good definition. There's questions about whether there's too much of interpretivism out there. Maybe is interpretivism actually better than other social science? Do we need less interpretivism, maybe? Interpretivism, it's kind of, I don't know, a problem, maybe. It's a little weird. Interpretivism, maybe this is the sort of, it's not a war, but it is a little bit of a fight, right? Interpretivism is something that makes people anxious. It's not the only thing. In sort of qualitative research, there are some agendas that make people equally weird, equally aggressive, maybe even more so. Here's an article that came out in Political Analysis very recently. Sherry Zaks says that something called Bayesian process tracing introduces more bias than it corrects for, which sounds rough. That doesn't seem like okay. So there's a fight here. There are fights here, right? Another thing we maybe want to think about this. What are we talking about? What's going on? Why are people upset? I've gone a little outside political science here because I like the title. The tail wagged by the dag. Pretty cute. People get upset sometimes about contemporary theories of causal inference. I've had friends talk about the causal inference mafia, which is out there in political science, I don't know, cracking down on people and ruling out all the really cool research and saying you just have to have an identification strategy or you can't do your work, right? These are fights that people still have. There is still area for contention around these margins, I think, around these spaces. And if that's true, I guess it's worth asking a little bit why and what these fights are doing. How is it that first of all, how is it that we're having these fights? Can we find ways of bridging them, and do we want to? So that's really what I want to think about today. So what are these things that I've just pointed us at? What is going on behind them? Is there an epistemological conflict that's causing these tensions? And what does that even mean? This is kind of my agenda. I know this sounds abstract. I hope it will work and be interesting as we go forward. The way I'm going to approach this, I'm going to give a practical example as a kind of definition of each of these things, and then talk from the point of view of someone who does each of these kinds of work about what the epistemological commitments of each of them are, to try to see what kinds of things they're thinking about when they do their work, so that we can see where they're coming from and if that might be the basis for the fights that are going on. So we'll start with interpretivism here. So an example of a study from last year that's interpretivist is this piece by Lee, who in testing is as the blind spot of nuclear non-use. So we have a lot of work in international relations about why nuclear weapons haven't been used since World War II, right? Is this because of deterrence or a cultural taboo or something like that? And Lee says, well, actually there's a mistake here, because if you talk to people on islands in the Pacific, they'll tell us that nuclear weapons have actually been used hundreds of times since World War II as tests. And the thing is, if you live on an island where a nuclear weapon gets tested, you probably don't care whether it was used in a conflict or not, because your island gets ruined either way. And then we could say, okay, yeah, but it's not a conflict. Well, what counts as a conflict, Lee asks us, is a colonial conflict between colonized people in the Pacific and colonizing forces a conflict or not a conflict? International relations has usually defined that as not a conflict, because it's not like a defined shooting war between nations. And so the fact that nuclear tests happen in the context of that kind of struggle between colonized people and colonizing forces doesn't count as nuclear use in the context of a conflict. But maybe we should ask whether that's reasonable. And if we ask if that's reasonable and take into account the experiences of the people who say this is a war, a lot of our theories about nuclear weapons need to be discussed differently and maybe even re-theorized. Maybe nuclear weapons do get used, but they get used in contexts really different from what we usually think of as wars. So what's going on here isn't our theories are wrong, so much as our theories are using words wrong, is the argument that Lee is making. And that's the classic kind of move that interpretivists want us to make. They're not going to say, the facts that you're saying are true or false, or your theory is causally correct. A lot of the time, sometimes, but that's classically not the intervention they want to make. What they usually want to say, and I'm following here Lisa Wedeen's argument from about 15 years ago, they want us to look at how power relationships are involved in the way that we define the words and concepts that shape the claims we're making. So it's not that the claim is true or false necessarily. It's who gets to define the words to begin with. Who says what counts as a war? Who says what counts as using nuclear weapons? If you say that imperial countries get to define those things so that entire islands being blown up in the Pacific don't count as any of that, you are leaving some things in and defining some things out. And that awareness is what interpretivists are interested in. That's not a kind of causal knowledge. It's a different contribution to social science. It's taking the boundary of what the subject matter includes and doesn't include and trying to shift it. And I think that is something that we don't always have a good language for outside the interpretive space. But this is, I think, and I'm doing my best here as someone who is not usually a practitioner of this method. This is, I think, the center of gravity of this tradition. Okay, moving to Bayesian process tracing. Process tracing as a whole is one of the central methods in kind of less interpretive qualitative research in sociology and political science. This is the idea that if you have a theory, a causal theory of a phenomenon, you want to find evidence that you can use to test that theory. So you say, okay, I think that right-wing politicians get elected when external pressures destabilize the existing axis of competition within a political system. If that's true, then I should be able to look at Brazil when Bolsonaro is elected and identify a new political issue that came into the space around the time he was elected, something that the existing political parties weren't able to address, something like the Lava Jato scandal, right? And say, okay, yeah, there's a destabilization of the existing axis of competition. Nobody was able to deal with this corruption scandal that kind of discredited. That's good. But you should also be able to say that scandal introduced new issues, not just a disruption of the dimension. There's new issues that come out of that define a new competitive space. Bolsonaro should have agenda items that we could point to that are because of that. The way that Trump has, his agenda items for cracking down on immigrants in the US. And we'd want to go look for that. That's what a Bayesian, process tracing approach is. You want to take a theory, think through what the implications are, make a big list, and then go look for pieces of evidence to fit with that. I'm being very simple and schematic, but that's the idea. If you want a lot more information, talk to Derek Beach in January. His class is amazing. I'm not going to do the whole thing. That's the basic idea. The Bayesian version is an elaborate formalization of this, primarily by Tasha Fairfield and her husband and co-author, Derek Jarman, that's come out in recent years. So I have an example here that we'll look at, and then we'll hear some of the ideas. So Bayron, Pass, and Guillaume Fontaine have a version of this that's looking at policy innovation in Colombia. Okay, so I have the abstract whatever, but here is the causal pathway that they're interested in. So they say there's a shift in the locus of authority. That's their trigger. The outcome is a policy innovation happens. This is a sort of an area of literature that I don't know that much about, so I'm not going to talk a ton about the argument, but the structure makes sense to me. That's what we're looking for here. And they have steps along the way where the policy network discredits the status quo, whatever. This is the kind of thing you want in process tracing, where you have a cause, you have intermediate steps you're looking for in an outcome. This is classically what we want. Where this gets to be Bayesian is that you have a whole bunch of stuff like this. I've got you a screenshot here of an entire page. We are not going to read this together, but you can see on the screen that they're talking about facts about things that happened in Colombia and saying that under a particular theory, this fact has probability 0.87, and this other fact has probability 0.57. And so, this ends up weighing in a certain way, and our posterior confidence for hypothesis such and such is 0.6. They do this for every single fact that they introduce in the argument for every single theory. Those of you who've read qualitative research before, this is not the way that it's always written, I'm going to say. This is maybe a little unusual. But this kind of formalization leads to the ability at the end of the paper to say, we end up with a likelihood ratio of such and such in favor of one hypothesis over the other. We're able to actually add all of the evidence across the whole case study together and give a final weight of the evidence that's a formal quantitative measure, almost like as if we'd done a regression or something, which I think is kind of interesting and kind of fun. There's a formality and a statistical structure to this that some qualitative people find off-putting and other people find exciting, that we can get here. So what Fairfield and Sharman say here is that we want to encode our qualitative knowledge mathematically in a way that anyone can read it and agree with us. I think that's a very ambitious goal. It's a very nice goal, but a very ambitious goal. We want to set up a set of explicit, mutually exclusive rival hypotheses and test them using a formal mathematical evaluation of our evidence from the point of view of each of the hypotheses, and then use Bayes' rule and formal math to combine the results at the end. This is a way of taking the insights that you get from traditional qualitative research and structuring the reasoning that you do with it to make sure, number one, that your reasoning is more transparent and more replicable than it might otherwise be. And number two, to make sure that you can clarify exactly how much information you are getting from your case study, right? Is this a case study that is a little bit persuasive and people read it, should change their mind just a little bit? Or is this a case study that actually seals the deal? We have kind of totally got you all the way there. The case study here is claiming that we should be pretty completely persuaded. This likelihood ratio is enough that we should be changing our minds, which is a strong claim. So either they are wrong about the way they are treating their evidence, or we should believe whatever it is they're saying about policy. One of those two things is true. And that's pretty neat, in my opinion. Like, I think the ability to be clear about that is a really useful feature of what is otherwise a little bit of tedious mathematical structure to this. So there's so this is the stuff that, coming back up here for a moment, Sherry Zaks doesn't like. So we have some positives possibly and negatives. Now we have the contemporary causal inference stuff. This is probably more familiar, I would guess, to more of you than maybe, I'm not sure about the audience, maybe the first two. I have an example, which is near and dear to my heart these days. As many of you know, I'm personally a far-right terrorist. No, I study the politics of the far right. So the question is, what are the long-term causal effects of far-right terrorism in New Zealand? So these folks want to look at the effects of the Christchurch mosque attack in 2019 on attitudes about Muslims. And so they look at people just before and just after the attack and see, does the attack make them kind of more accepting of Muslims? You can tell this is a causal inference kind of study because it has an entire section of the paper called Causal Identification Strategy, which is the language of causal inference. So they say, the basis of all causal estimation methodologies is to be like a randomized experiment, basically. You want the exposed and unexposed groups, the treatment and control groups, to be exchangeable, which means you can swap them and they're just like each other, except that one was treated and the other wasn't. So that means we want to say that people who were in 2018 New Zealand before the mosque attack and people who were in 2019 after the mosque attack are just the same as each other, except that their attitudes change because they have this information. There's no other meaningful difference between them. Now, if we were to compare people from 2010 to people from 2025, that assumption would be wrong. Like there's huge differences in the world. 2025, we have all the, right-wing politics going around, all kinds of information like that. 2010, it's way back in the day, that's back before immigration, all kinds of stuff, right? But if you compare just before and just after the mosque shooting, it probably makes sense that there wouldn't be a big difference. And especially if we have large samples and you do maybe a little bit of work to balance the groups and all kinds of things like that, which is what they do. And so we end up with this nice comparison where you're able to look at the gap right where the orange turns to blue and see that there's a jump in attitudes about Muslims. There's a little bit of extra warmth towards Muslims that happens right at the moment of the attack that breaks the regression line. So the regression line hops up a little bit. And we think that probably that terror attack created a long-term, and it looks pretty durable, increase in warmth towards Muslims. So that is the argument. And that's the kind of thing that you get in this kind of causal inference stuff. Winship and Morgan have a classic book that kind of explains the tradition. The basics of the framework here that we think of as causation as counterfactual manipulation, which is basically a way of saying it's an experiment. Everything, every study always is either a randomized experiment, a laboratory experiment, a field experiment, or it should have been. And so we try to clean it up to make it an experiment. Everything's always an experiment or a broken experiment. And we want to use statistics to fix the way it broke. That's what causal inference is in contemporary statistical research. So we use our statistical techniques to remove the ways that nature messed up our experiments and get back to the cleanest, best average treatment effect estimate. And that's all we ever do. That's it. There's really not a lot else to it. That's all. I mean, that's the world. The point I want to make, I have the slide. Are there epistemological tensions here? Are these three traditions the same? Clearly not, right? Each of these three things is doing hugely, remarkably, profoundly different things, to the point where, like, talking about things they have in common seems very difficult. Number one. Number two, it is not at all clear to me that these three traditions are doing things that are in any way opposite of each other. So when we see these things as having, people sort of grouchy with each other, I can note that the people like John Gearing, who gets upset about interpretivism, is much more associated with both the kind of qualitative research, the process tracing stuff, and with causal inference. So, he likes these two, he doesn't like that one, right? Lisa Wadeen doesn't maybe like causal inference very much. In fact, she gets along very poorly with causal inference people. Yeah, okay. Like there's lines of tension we can draw. But that's not, I don't think, because these people are doing work that is opposite of each other. There isn't an opposite relationship here. Interpretivism isn't the opposite of causal inference. Interpretivism is doing something different from, but it's different from along a dimension that's unrelated, right? Interpretivism isn't bad causal inference. It's simply not causal inference a lot of the time, or its main goal isn't causal inference. Process tracing isn't bad interpretivism. It's different from interpretivism. These are not in tension because they contradict each other. They're in tension because they're driving towards different projects, perhaps. So I want to do an interpretivist move here and say, when we see epistemological tension, this is not a thing that exists in the world, right? This is a category that people produce. This is a thing, this is an action people do, not a thing that simply neutrally exists. So what we want to ask is not, is there epistemological tension? We want to say, what practices are epistemological tensions? What practices are epistemological compatibilities? What does it look like when people do each of these things? And I'm going to report to you, as someone who's for many years been casually carrying out ethnography of social science, I've seen quite a lot of discussion around this. I haven't taken careful notes, as I probably should have, but I can tell you what it looks like when people do epistemological tension. What it looks like is people say, this research doesn't mean anything to me. This is boring. It doesn't ask questions I care about. This doesn't make sense. This just doesn't speak to me. I don't really see how this looks like political science or sociology. Like maybe this is humanities. Maybe this is economics, right? I don't get it. I don't get it. This is people performing epistemological tension. On the other hand, people performing epistemological compatibility looks like, all right, I see that you have some like philosophy stuff going on, but this tool is so cool. Maybe we could co-author, right? Like I totally don't know about Foucault or like Judea Pearl or whatever. That's way above my head. But like, can you teach me this R script or how to do this like fieldwork thing? It's the coolest thing. And I've seen both of these things all the time. If we live in a world, and I claim, based on the experience I've had in the profession, that we do, in which both of those sets of practices are extremely common, then it is not the case that these traditions are either inherently in epistemological tension or inherently epistemologically compatible. Instead, scholars produce one or the other of those. They choose to act in one or the other way. And I have a hypothesis. My hypothesis is that scholars produce epistemological tension between methods when they face threats to their own way of doing work. And they produce epistemological compatibility when they want to take advantage of attractive ideas, tools, or marks of prestige from another tradition. In other words, I think that there are strategic and career-oriented reasons why we choose to engage in practices of epistemological tension and epistemological compatibility. I think these are not hard to understand necessarily. I think people, when they see their kind of work dismissed and made irrelevant a priori without engagement in the work they've done, respond by producing epistemological tension. And conversely, when they see work that has elements that can help them succeed, they respond by producing epistemological compatibility. So what can we do with this? I'm going to sort of suggest a couple of different ways that we could proceed as kind of a methodological paper with this. And then I'm also going to conclude with some maybe implications for social science as a whole. The first is that right, now this is the, right, that's the first I want to come to this. First, as a testable implication, this is a kind of proposal. I haven't done this yet, but I want to hear people's feedback. This is an idea. We could carry out an experiment by recruiting scholars to participate. We could randomly assign scholars as part of a survey experiment to a treatment condition that raises salience of reduced scholarly resources. We could have people read a text that mentions something about how difficult it is, right, to train graduate students in a situation like the present, where so many sources of funding for graduate student research and other sources, research grants are missing because the US government and other agencies have shut down a huge number of sources of funding. And how do you think we should deal with this? I have not said anything in that text about specific methodologies at all, right? But saying that does raise the point that there is a seriously reduced funding pool for research. If I'm right that that kind of seriously reduced pool where there's a threat to everybody's ability to get work done is going to put people in a scarcity mindset, and that's going to create incentives for competition, that would tend to create methodological tension or epistemological tension. Second, we could randomly assign other scholars to a condition that raises salience of the way that each of the three traditions we've discussed gives scholars for being productive with fewer resources. We could talk about the ways that interpretivism helps people do projects using digital resources and not having to always do field work. You can do digital ethnography through Zoom or with existing archives. You can do lots of more inexpensive approaches to complement quantitative research with interpretive methods. You can use causal inference techniques to improve data that are flawed without having to carry out expensive primary collection. You can use case study techniques to study one or a few cases and learn a lot from them rather than always having to every single time do large quantitative studies. These are techniques that allow us to get more from less. And I think that that is another thing we can say that is a little more directly about the traditions. But the point there is we're talking about tools that solve the problem. That treatment is an alternative, right? We randomize people to one of these two. And we see if they change the compatibility intention. Neither of these is epistemological at all. One of them is purely pragmatic. The other one doesn't mention methods. And I want to ask, among other things, questions about, are there epistemological contradictions between these methods at the end? Not the only thing, because then it gives away what the thing is, but among others. My hunch is that this second condition will increase people's sense of epistemological compatibility and reduce epistemological tension. The first condition will do the opposite, even though neither of them is about epistemology, because I believe that our epistemological views are a little bit more sort of scientific politics than we often think. So that's one of the things that I think we can kind of potentially do as methodologists, is some of this kind of sociology of science work. A second thing we can do is actually demonstrate work that combines these tools and doesn't run into problems. As a pragmatist, this is always attractive to me. If you can show people that you can do things, that is a way of answering epistemological problems. So I want to quickly show you, just for kicks, an example of work that I've done recently with a graduate student that does a little bit of, I'm not as strongly the causal inference stuff. It's a little more data science than causal inference, but the other two traditions are present here. This is a project about how US women navigate the far right in the US, which we're calling overtly misogynistic, which I think is probably true. So how do women, respond to when they are participating in far right media spaces? How do they do that? There's a couple different theories. I have a chat thing. Oh, right, great. Yeah, I'll be done in just a few minutes. Yeah, thank you. Right.
No, you're doing great. I'm just
okay.
letting everyone know to get ready.
No, perfect.
This is exciting, and we're going to jump
All right,
in.
Good. So
you're
when
good.
women participate,
you're all good.
Yeah, when women participate, we have a couple theories that we want to test about how they participate. One is that women might do kind of a proto-feminist, and I'm going to say proto-feminist because these are far-right women in a far-right space thing, and attempt to advance outcomes for other women. They could undermine the sexism of the space by creating space for women to run for politics. They could create space for women to get outside the home. They could talk about how women are actually better than you think, talk women up. The other thing that could happen is that they could engage in sexist rhetoric, play into traditional gender roles, and other things that fit with the sexist expectations of the space in order to potentially advance their personal career. These are both, I think, reasonable expectations. It's not totally clear. You could potentially even do both in some ways. What we want to do to figure this out is we use a data science workflow to gather transcripts of women's participation in podcasts on the Alex Jones network and a set of other far-right networks in the US, and compare women to men based on kind of gender performance in their voice in terms of the topics that they discuss and the way they discuss those topics. So then we have some case studies to look in depth into that. And I'll get into the case studies in just a moment. I have some really blurry, unfortunately, photos of some of the modeling that we did on this. So one of them is we have that women turn out to talk way more about COVID and vaccine conspiracies compared to men. So women are out there talking about how they as mothers really need to protect their kids' health from the dangers of the COVID vaccine and all the autism that you can get from it. So that makes sense. I mean, health and mothering and nurturing is a female gender stereotype, and that plays in completely. This fits with the kind of sexist role performance expectation. A second one that is a little more complicated is that there's a topic in our modeling that has to do with parenting and gender in schools. And this one women talk about more than men. So what is this? Well, we look into this, and this is almost entirely about protecting children from the threats of the LGBTQ movement. You have to protect children from, as mothers, protect children from the danger of LGBTQ people and the LGBTQ agenda. And this is a topic that's very prevalent on the far right in the US. So how do mothers do this? It turns out I read every topic in our data that had to do with this mothering and LGBTQ whatever thing. The topic changed over time. The mothering topic changed over time. Earlier on in our data, women on the far right in our data were talking about how they needed to be at home with their children to keep them safe from the threats of queer people. That they really needed to be present in the home to provide a strong foundation of, cis-het Christian faith. But over time, this evolved into an outward-facing activist vision of motherhood. So towards the end of our data, for example, we have a representative of an activist group talking about how women need to get out into the community. They need to join their school board. They need to run for city council. They need to get involved in the board meetings of the library. They need to be present in public as mothers to defeat the LGBTQ agenda. Mothering is a public, outward-facing vision towards the end of this space. These women are redefining the category of mothering. The word doesn't change, but the meaning connected to the word changes. The threat also doesn't change. It's still queer people, right? But the way you react to that threat fundamentally changes. Women are supposed to campaign out in the community alongside men and in professional political roles to fight back against the LGBTQ threat. So there is a way that these women are redefining the meaning of a category to expand the space they can occupy, which I think is really interesting because we're seeing a split between the two theories here. They're fitting within a gendered expectation and also transforming it to create opportunity. Both things happening at once. Okay, I'm going to skip this one. And our case studies we want to use to try to explore how these things work in specific instances. I'm going to focus in on one of these, which is Laura Loomer, who is a far-right activist who's currently an informal advisor to the President of the United States, who apparently has the power to fire cabinet members at will, which has happened several times this year. So this is someone who went from being a broadcaster on a series of different online right-wing spaces to now being arguably the third most powerful person in the world. Quite a trajectory, right? So our question is, if you're this person who's on the cusp of becoming one of the most powerful people in the world, do you still have to conform to feminine gender stereotypes when you appear on far-right media? If there's a pure sort of power relationship, we would expect that no, because she should be more powerful than most of the media figures she appears with. On the other hand, if the gender stuff is more ingrained in the space than normal power dynamics, then maybe yes. So we can look at an interview from just 3 years ago when Laura Loomer was far more famous than almost any figure on the far right. She appears in an Alex Jones interview. She says, let's start with the groomer ad, the pedophile ad. Yeah, after my campaign ended, I was actually invited to come work with a PAC called American Liberty Fund. But even though these issues of sexualization of our children and people dying from vaccine injuries and the death shot and children getting myocarditis are in the news, blah, blah, blah. So what we see with this quote, and I cut off a little bit of, she rambles and Alex Jones, what I mostly cut out was Alex Jones interrupting her, which is constant on that show and very boring. What we see here is a couple of things that I think are important. First of all, we see she leads in with a pedophile groomer ad, which is language the far right uses to talk about LGBTQ people. So we're talking about an LGBTQ threat against sexualization of our children, which is that LGBTQ mothering topic. This is that. The death shot and children getting myocarditis is the COVID topic. I have to maybe decode this stuff. This isn't possibly how most people talk about these things, but this is how the far right talks about them. This is what's going on. At the same time, she's also talking about her campaign she ran for Congress in the US, her political action committee, the American Liberty Fund, which is a general purpose far-right activist group, which was her platform for eventually working with the Trump campaign and getting into her broader position. The thing we would want to do here, if we were to be Bayesian process tracers, is break apart this statement into pieces and ask ourselves, if Laura Loomer was purely acting as a just embodiment of feminine gender roles, how likely is each piece, right? The pieces where she's saying groomer ad, pedophile ad, sexualization, vaccine injury, myocarditis, those pieces are very likely under that theory. Like I don't know, do we say 0.8, 0.9, 0.7? The specific numbers are hard. You would have to give a specific number. I'm going to skip it, but we're supposed to. The part where she talks about her campaign and her political action committee are much less likely. On the other hand, if she is using the gender stuff as a platform for pivoting to personal ambition, the combination of gender stuff and the platform things, that juxtaposition is very likely. So the combination of the data as a whole fits very, very well with the theory that the gendered behavior is being used strategically to build her platform, and only medium well with the theory that she is a sort of pure representative of gendered norms and doesn't sort of have an agenda of advancing her own interests. So I think that we could take this and say, well, no, this piece of evidence fits one of those two theories much better than the other. And you run this through multiple quotes across multiple case studies, we're going to end up seeing that there's a lot of evidence in favor of the claim that these women are using the platform strategically, taking advantage of the gender incentives that we saw in the previous slides to advance their ambitions. Just in the same way that women redefined motherhood to open space for ambition, these people are also advancing ambition. Okay, so I'm going to skip our conclusions here, which I think are fun, but the point I'm trying to make here is that you can do work like what we just did. We might have done it badly. It's fine if we did. The point I want to make is you can say we did it badly because we got the subject matter wrong. I don't want you to say we did it badly because we used methods that don't make sense, because what's the point of that, right? Tell us what we missed, or tell us what we should do to add to it. Don't say these things don't make sense together, because of course they do. Like, we just did some stuff and we learned things. That's all we need. Pluralism reigns. We're still fighting about methods. I think we produce methodological controversies when we need them. And we as a community, and this is my final point, can set standards that make epistemological divides less politicized. By making substantive conversations richer and evaluating work based on whether it helps us understand things about political and social phenomena, rather than thinking about whether the work resembles things we're familiar with. That lowers the stakes in terms of some of the conflicts that breed the epistemological divides that we have seen before. And there I'm going to stop.
Okay, this is a exciting place to stop to start the conversation. So as I sent in the chat to remind everyone, there's two ways to participate. And this is the department's seminar. So we really want students to speak first and to speak up and to raise questions and discuss. So what I want to invite is, there's a chat. You can send your question. There's different ways to participate, but you can raise your hand. You can put yourself in the chat and write your question. I know we're online, as we were talking about in the beginning. We don't want it to be just me reading the questions. We really would like to give your voice and for you to ask questions. And I think also in the transparency, since we are in Brazil and we're trying to be fluid, if you want to ask the question in Portuguese and I translate, that's fine too. We want to invite everyone to ask questions. I think maybe just because for everyone that's listening to what you're speaking about, and I think to get us started as people are writing questions, I think one of the things that's very interesting that you're talking about is something that there is a intimacy between talking about methods and pluralism of methods and the training that students are undertaking when you train in a field, and how that changes over time and generationally. And so I think one of the things maybe Jay, to start the conversation to think about is what when you're in this implication of this discussion you're laying out of this argument, I'm thinking about another testable implication has to do with generationally, or where we are in the process, and especially thinking about, as we think about, am I a student, am I a professor, how many papers have I published, when do I choose this what we're talking about? Are we polarizing methods because we need to kind of move up the ladder, or are we polarizing methods because we're trying to keep as kind of like a gatekeeping? And I think what you were talking about when we talked about the examples about thinking about in moving outside of methods and thinking about the examples you were talking about with gender is the same thing, is that how are we using this? When do we operationalize or choose to operationalize conflict is very strategic in the trajectory of where we are in our careers. And I think this is important to talk about, especially since we have students, because sometimes what happens is students come in, they're very young inside of a field, very vulnerable to training with a specific method, and being convinced that there's a right, a supreme way to do this type of research, by someone who's more senior, who's more powerful, or vice versa, or that what they were convinced that was right is wrong. So I think maybe to start, before people ask questions, maybe if you want to comment about, to talk a little bit about this, what we're talking about, how does this fit in with what you're, how you're seeing this evolve, this issue of, are we becoming more conflictive over time, and do we need to kind of impose this conflict, or should be we finding kind of more commonalities? Does that have to do with where we are in our academic training?
Yes. So I don't have the best data on whether we're becoming more but my strong sense is that social science as a whole is becoming less conflictual around methods over time. That there are areas where there's still conflict, but that the overall intensity and degree of conflict is a lot less than it used to be. A lot of the divides that used to exist, where people used to fight to prevent rational choice folks from getting hired in departments, or try to establish rational choice only departments or experiments only departments or things like that. And as far as I can tell, none of that stuff really happens very much anymore. Like, everybody seems to be kind of okay with the idea that departments are going to have different kinds of people, and conferences are going to maybe have different kinds of people, and it's just that way. And there are frictions that exist, but it's at generally speaking, lower level than it used to be. But I think the question around sort of, different points in careers, I think is really interesting. I think, yeah, I think it's interesting to think about how you should think about this as you move through your career. What I recommend for graduate students is, if you want to be a person who loves methods and learns a ton of them, graduate school is a great time to do that. I can't think of anyone who just loves methods for their own sake. That's a hard person. No, I'm kidding. I'm that person, but not everybody is that person, I recognize. So if you are that person like me, then go crazy in grad school. It's a wonderful time for that. But if you're not that person, you just have like one or two things that you love and you want to be great at that and then do your work, that's fine. But the thing I want to say is, you can market yourself because you're wonderful at that, without having to say that this is the right and best and only way to do social science. You just need to show us how you can help us learn things. That's all. That's it. People will be excited to talk to you because you can show us cool answers to questions. You don't have to denigrate other ways of doing work. And in fact, you build bridges when you don't. Like, you build bridges when you're an enthusiastic and curious listener to other people. And that's the way that I want to encourage people to think about this.
That's awesome. Okay, so we are starting to get questions and comments. Vinicius, I don't know if, because we first go with students. So Vinicius, I don't know if you want to speak your question or you want me to answer your question, but I'm gonna, if you can, I'm gonna just try to see if I can navigate this correctly, to try to see if I can give Vinicius his voice. Vinicius, are you allowed? You can talk? Yes? Vinicius, do you want to ask your question, or do you prefer for me to read it?
Hello, Professor. If you if you prefer to read it, please go ahead.
Okay. So, but you spoke so beautifully, and then we're in a room together. So speak. It's
Very
a
well
great
then.
question. Go ahead.
Very well then. Um, Thank you so much for your great presentation, Professor. It's a bit jarring how social and political scientists are sometimes unable to realize how their conflicts beyond social and politically developed, in my opinion. My question is about institutional and more practical solutions to these matters. Do you have any ideas or data about policies, regulations, and more concrete actions that we could implement to help us all mitigate these tensions in academia about different methodologies?
I think that's a wonderful question, and I don't have data on that. This is a newer kind of research area for me, but I think that that's a wonderful question. Regulations, I think, are hard. It's difficult to manipulate, or you don't get a lot of change over time, other than, I guess, well, we've had huge change over time in the US over the last year, but not the sort that probably is productive of positive values in academic tension. It's just everyone is incredibly panicked all the time about everything, and I'm not sure that we can get a lot of causal leverage out of that. That aside, we usually don't get clean, nice institutional change very often in academic institutions. It's a pretty conservative space. But policies and norms and messages and things like that, I think, are interesting things to think about. And that's a little bit what I was trying to get at with the experiment I was proposing, where we're trying to think about, when we think about policies and norms and stuff, we're thinking about trying to change the mind space and value system that people are operating within. And so the messages I was priming in that experiment were trying to get at some of that. I would love to think about other ways of doing things like that. And I would love for other people to think about this. This kind of sociology of science stuff is one of the areas of methodology that I think is underserved and deserves more attention. So I encourage people to do this kind of stuff.
Okay, great. I think we have a couple of questions. I'm just going to acknowledge that I see everyone's here. So maybe also to ask, I'm going to bring in a couple of people to speak at the same time. Sergio and Manuel, who are professors, and Florencia and Henok. We have 4 people who've asked questions, but maybe if we can start with 2 questions that were kind of related. So Sergio, actually, I don't know if Sergio, if you want to ask your question, but it touches a little bit on what just Vinicius says. So maybe it's appropriate as the second question. And then we can turn to Manuel, who I don't know what he's going to ask, but we'll turn it to Manuel and Florencia. So Sergio, if you want to ask, or do you want me to read? Sergio asks something. Sergio, are you there? I'm going to just read what he said. Thank you for your, the insightful presentation, Jay. And then considering the significant resource constraints by Brazilian political science, which approach would you recommend for the organization of academic events and conferences? Dedicated panels focusing separately on quantitative and qualitative and multi-method approaches, or integrated panels that combine substantive research with methodological discussions? And I think this is it very touches on what Vinicius is saying as an example.
No. I think that's a very interesting question. I think that, so when we're doing methodological work, having separate panels for different methods obviously makes sense. Like if you're doing methodological work on interpretive methods or something, and you invite me to do that, I think that might be fun sometimes, but probably not most of the time. You probably want people who are experts on that most of the time. I have been into a couple of interpretivist methods things, and it's been fun, but I'm definitely the outsider in the group. So for that kind of discourse, I think you usually do want dedicated separate things. When it's substantive work, though, I am a huge advocate of methodologically integrated substantive panels. I think quantitative and qualitative and interpretive and whatever people working on, for example, the far right together, have a lot to talk about together. Like when I teach graduate seminars on subject matter, we read across all the different methods. And why wouldn't we? a huge amount of the best work on far-right politics is qualitative. Some of it is quantitative, a little bit of it is experimental, and some of it is ethnographic and interpretive and historical. And so we read all of that stuff. And, we're not going to keep it in boxes and boundaries, because we want people to see all the good work. And I think that panels should also be that way. And we want to start conversations across these boundaries. There are things to argue about across methodological traditions and things to learn from across methodological traditions within subject matters.
We're going to move to Manuel. I don't know if,
Yeah.
Manuel, you have your microphone open. So
Yeah. Thank you. Hi, Jay. Very nice to have you back at our department, at least online.
Yes, I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah. Great presentation. It would be I wrote a paper that is under review that is discussing, that is arguing that there is compatibility between causal inference and Bayesian process tracing. And when I read your chapter that you shared with us, I was thinking, oh my God, I should have read this before. It would help me. But maybe I can include in the when answering to the reviewers. But I'll go to
And
my
maybe I should quote your paper in the chapter. It hasn't quite come out yet. So.
Okay, I'll share with you.
Good.
So I have a feedback for your survey experiment and a question. Okay. So first the feedback, since you asked. I was thinking that for condition 2 of the treatment, maybe it would be important to talk about how using different traditions together would be accepted for publication, right? Because that's a concern. So I think it would increase the strength of the treatment if you talk not only about being productive, but also being able to publish it. Because for me at least, I would think, well, maybe it's productive, but if they won't accept the paper, I won't do it, right? So just be explicit about it. That's one thing that I was thinking about. The other is that perhaps it should be nice to have a neutral condition.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And
no, there could be a control group that just doesn't get any of them.
Yeah. And finally, I think that it would be better if you could test not only that framing in a productive way would increase the share of people that think they are compatible, but if you could test that this explanation moves more the share of people that agree than people who thinks that they have a different belief system, that they are incompatible, right? Because what you are saying is that it's not a matter of believing that they are incompatible, but it's a strategic reaction. So I'm trying to manipulate the strategic reaction.
Yeah.
But I think it would be better if you could not only saying that manipulating the strategic part improves the share of people that agree that they are compatible, but also that it explains more of the variance than the belief system. So something like that.
So the possibly most upsetting thing about what I think I'm saying is that I think that the belief system is actually also strategic. I think that probably when we're feeling like there's an epistemological divide, we believe that. And when we're feeling like they're compatible, we believe that. I think that we, even as academics, just like everyone else, rationalize our beliefs, and that we do that in this space too. So I probably am going in a direction here where I think that it's like a political psychology kind of argument. And we probably, in my opinion, have beliefs here that are not necessarily strategic in the sense of like we're openly choosing them, but like affected by incentives, right?
Okay. Motivated reasoning.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. That's it.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense. Okay. So
Yeah.
those were my feedbacks, and now my
Thank
question.
you. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome. So when you were discussing applying Bayesian process tracing, you gave an example, and you talk about uh, a text, and this is a piece of evidence, and this is a piece of evidence, and this is another piece of evidence.
Yes.
And so my question is, how do you determine or distinguish when something is a different piece of evidence or when it's a single piece of evidence?
Oh, I love it.
If you can
So,
just
yeah,
discuss this a little bit, I would appreciate. Thank you very much.
sure. Yeah, according to Fairfield and Sharman, this is not a high stakes question. So you can kind of decide on your own. If we were to take that quote that I looked at and regard the whole thing as one piece of evidence, then it's a big important piece of evidence. If we're to split it into 7 or 8 pieces of evidence, then each of them is smaller and will have less weight than the whole thing. But if we do it carefully and work through it appropriately, we should, in the end, according to them, get the same basic answer either way. So the boundaries between pieces of evidence can be kind of fuzzy and ambiguous, and it's supposedly not going to matter that much. I'm not sure if that's true, but that's the official story in that tradition, is that you get to choose and it doesn't really matter. Um, I don't know if that's right, but that is what they said.
Florencia's, now we have Florencia's question.
Thank you, Professor Lorena. Can you hear me?
We can hear you perfect.
Thank you. And thank you, Jay, for the great presentation. I thought all of the explanations and the theory that you're building very relatable, which I think it's a good sign of a theory that has applicability for thinking about, I don't know, our lives and so on. One thing that it made me think a bit was, how do you think, and I tried to write down in the question, I think it's in some ways related to Sergio's questions, is how communities of expertise in a given topic interact with your theory. So for instance, if I'm debating on an area of the world that I feel that I know about, I might not care so much about the methodological differences because I can talk about the factuality of the world. So I read a theory, an explanation of the world, and I say, this does not sound reasonable. And I might not even focus too much on the methodological aspect because I have other ways of accessing that debate. But if I don't know about it, so I don't know, I studied taxation. If I discuss with someone issues of taxation, I probably can interact, not worrying too much about the methodological divide, but on the substantive issues that the person is arguing for. But if I don't know a lot about the topic, the methodological divide might become a bit more salient. So I was wondering if you thought about this and how this might interact with your theory. That was kind of the question.
No, I think you're absolutely right that shared subject matter interests are a real bridge. And I think that this is a really key way to open up your methodological interests to a broader audience, is even if someone else isn't interested in your taxation project right off the bat, if you can give stories and sort of applicability and subject matter that interests and hooks people at the introduction of your paper or talk, it opens up the subject matter to them as interesting in a way that's going to bridge methodological divides a lot of the time, in my experience. So I think I agree with you. And I think that this is an example of one of the things that we do that produces epistemological compatibility. If people are motivated because they're interested in your subject matter, then that is one of the ways that we choose not to get hung up on, I don't like your method. right? We choose to instead say, this is a really cool topic. I want to hear what you have to say. I might disagree with your method. Oh, there's no identification strategy. Oh no, I can't, but, and I've read a ton of reviews and things like that where people say, well, technically there's no identification strategy. However, the subject matter is so important that, and that doesn't make sense from a lot of people's formal methodological commitments. But I think it completely makes sense in light of what you're saying, Florencia. So I think you're right.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, we have Hanuk also has a question. I'm not sure, Hanuk, I think I need to move you up to be able to ask. Hold on a second, I'm moving you. And also, if there's anyone else who wants to ask, you can either raise your hand or you can type where it says Q&A. Manuel alerted me to the fact that the chat is turned off. So, but there's other ways to participate. So just to make sure, Hanuk, if you want to ask, yes, you're able to ask.
Good afternoon, Professor Seawright. Thank you very much for your fascinating presentation. You have a very interesting research agenda on how billionaires influence politics. I'd like to know how methodological pluralism could help us study such a hard-to-reach population. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, this is a project that I've been involved with in the US a little bit ago, and then I've had some grad students work on sort of billionaires in Latin America more recently. Billionaires are not the easiest people to study. They don't show up in surveys. They, in fact, in most of the world, most survey companies refuse to survey people above a certain threshold in wealth, even if they show up in a survey frame. So if you have someone in the US in the Forbes 2000 list, and their name shows up randomly on a survey, most survey firms will just delete that name and pick someone else. So their chance of inclusion in most surveys is literally zero. They will never, ever be included. Most survey firms will simply refuse to ever sample these individuals. They are not accessible. When you try to contact wealthy people, we did a survey of not billionaires, but hundreds of millionaires in the Chicagoland area. When you contact these people, you first set up an appointment with their scheduler's scheduler. And then you talk to that person, and then you get an appointment with their scheduler, and then you talk to that person, and then you finally make an appointment with the wealthy person. And then you figure out which of several different houses they're going to be at that day, and then you call them, and then you reschedule because they couldn't make the appointment, and then you call back and you reschedule again. And you keep doing that for weeks and weeks and weeks until you finally get your interview. Which means that the survey ends up costing 30 or 40 times more than if we were surveying normal people. All of these are reasons that this is a population that people usually just don't study. So how do we do it? What we did, and I'm talking about Paige, Lacombe, and myself, was we did employ a mixed methods approach. We used qualitative research, data science, and traditional quantitative methods together to build a combination of web scraping, process tracing, and just regression to gather information on the views of these people. So we ended up coming up with, through qualitative research, a list of search terms that captured the most relevant things to get on sort of Social Security and a bunch of other things to do Google searches that were the right terminology for billionaires to get them, that they use, what's their vocabulary? When billionaires talk about Social Security and welfare benefits, what words do they use? We had to do the research to capture that language space. Once we'd done that, we did Google News searches for each of those words plus billionaires and captured all of the news results on the first, I think it was 100 pages for each billionaire on the Forbes list. So that we did that, and that was an automated search process. We got this huge list of news topics. We eliminated all the redundancies and anything that wasn't actually about the billionaires. And then we went through and found all of the quotes from the billionaires in those search and coded by hand the content of those quotes in terms of the directionality and content. And also did topic modeling, although that was a little more difficult because the subject matter availability was not as good. Then we were able to do regression modeling on which billionaires spoke on each topic, how often, and what the directionality of each thing was relative to their wealth, their political contributions, and other things. And so we were able to mix these things together in a way where we were able to sort of triangulate and make up for the holes in the data. I've had other students, good grief. Recent student of mine who's an amazing student who's now an assistant professor at University of Chicago, whose name is blanking on me, and this really sucks, did an amazing project where she interviewed a bunch of the wealthiest people in Mexico, Uruguay, and Honduras through the internet, through Zoom during the pandemic, and also carried out a survey experiment on Latin American business school students to understand their attitudes around taxation and inequality. So like the youngest generation of wealthy people from the region, right? So there it's a combination of qualitative ethnographic methods plus an experiment to try to get different angles of the population and the methods. When we have groups like this, and I could keep going, but I'm not going to. This is a topic I'm very excited about. But when we have groups like this that are really hard to reach, no single method is going to work perfectly. So what you do is you use different angles and different pieces to plug holes, right? You use one thing to try to build your list of search terms. You use another thing to get a huge list of documents. You go through by hand to reduce redundancies. You identify whatever, and you mix and match until you have a combination that is not the same as a random sample, but comes as close as we can. This is the kind of balance that we try. All right. Thank you. I'm sorry that that was very long. I just like the topic.
No, and I think now we have Luis Suarez, who's I'm gonna move also to allow to talk and ask his question. I think Luis, you want to ask your question live? Yes, Luis, can you hear us? He should move up here and be able to speak. We moved him up. Luis, are you able? Maybe your microphone is not working.
Thank you, Professor Lorena. Yes, sorry for taking some time. Well, thank you, Professor Jay, for the presentation, as always. I would like to ask you about when you talk about the increasing pluralism in the available methods in political science, I think I'd like to ask you if it just doesn't make it more important for the students already in an undergraduate level to learn more about epistemology so they can make more informed decisions. We have the general idea of what epistemology is, but it's not in the same level as philosophy students do. And I think in this new context, I think exchanging the current way of teaching that's focused on methodological tools for deeper understanding people, especially for people to be able to differentiate from what are new epistemologies and methodologies and what are just bad epistemology. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay. No, I mean, First of all, yes, thank you. This is a great question. I do think that there are always challenges with curriculum. When we're thinking about undergraduates, we only have them for a certain amount of time, and we have to think about how we're going to spend the time. I think that when we have an undergraduate methods course, methodology is epistemology. It just is. But which parts of that are we going to emphasize? Are we going to emphasize the more practical edge of that, where we give them a set of concrete tools that they can go use in a paper? Or are we going to emphasize the kind of deeper roots of that give them skills they can use to evaluate different techniques down the road? There's probably a little bit of a curriculum and pedagogical trade-off there, because we don't have years, right? We have a quarter or a semester. And so if we do more of one thing, we're going to have to do less of another thing. I do agree that, there are just more and more tools. We have text as data stuff. We have people out there doing really fun things with ChatGPT and other large language models. We have the old statistical things. We have automated qualitative research. We have ethnography. All this stuff, and undergraduates are just going to kind of, I don't know, stare into the sun and get dazzled a little bit of the time. And so teaching them ways of thinking about choices among methods instead of just saying, here's a technique, go do it. I think there is value to that. I think that's right. I don't want to overwhelm them with material that is going to lead them to feel like they're out of their depth, right? I want them to feel mastery. So I don't want to push them into graduate level philosophical reading, if you know what I mean. Like there's always a set of trade-offs, but a lot of this depends on your students and what they can handle. So yeah, Luis, this is a wonderful question. Thank you.
Maybe though, if I can push you, we talked just a little bit about undergraduates, and most of the people who are here are graduate students.
Yes.
And you gave a couple of examples in your own work where you have mixed methods, and that requires kind of, I'm thinking about for the students who are co-authors or who are working with you on those projects, how is that journey in terms of, because usually kind of we think about self-selection, right? And thinking about maybe if we could talk through that a little bit, especially thinking about how many of the students are in that moment right now in their graduate careers.
All right. So Elizabeth, the student who was the co-author on the paper that the paper that I sort of fractionally used as an example here today. She is a recent PhD student of mine who initially was a pure student of international relations, and then crossed over into kind of more gender studies and methods. So there is still international relations in her portfolio, but it's kind of a broader array over time as she sort of became, I ended up being her main advisor. So it broadened out over time. And as she worked with me over the course of several years, like she added an experiment to her dissertation, and we learned together how that was going to work for her. So that was a creative experience for her. She initially was doing sort of pure quantitative kind of panel work, which is still in the dissertation, but that's just one chapter now. So there was this quantitative piece. There's also she worked with Jim Mahoney on building a case study component. And so there's a case study analysis of some representation of women in a couple of peace negotiations in a couple different countries in Africa that is not as finished as the rest of the dissertation, but a lot more developed in terms of skills than she was initially. And in this project, she had never done text as data or any of this kind of work before. So this was all new. The thing that was really fun from my perspective was that she'd also never done far right work. So a lot of the literature we were reading was new. And when we were drafting the paper, every time we wrote a draft, she kept coming back and saying, I'm not sure we should include this example. It seems really extreme. Wait a minute. No, this is about extremists. It's okay. So that there is also on the subject matter, but there is a, but this was an evolution that happened over the course of 5 years. She learned 4 or 5 really new methods, and expanded her toolkit a lot. And that has been wonderful. And she had an EPSR article and some other, I mean, she's had a huge amount of success. It's been really good. I don't think I was not as successful as that. Like, not everybody is going to be that this is not the bar. Like, but she is an example of someone who's really managed to learn a lot within the window of grad school. So maybe I'm very proud of her.
Okay, so I think maybe just to put you in a little bit of a hard place, but also because of what Luis said in the question, is that at the same time, I think one of the things that Luis said is,
yes,
and I'm going to use Luis's question to kind of go back to what he was saying, right? Luis said, in his question, he wrote, if the number of available methods is increasing, teaching the students to evaluate the validity of these methods and make informed choices is important. So I think this is kind of to go back to that. So because on the one hand, we're saying to students, the world is diverse. There's lots of methods. The more methods, the better that you know. And the more you push yourself into uncomfortable places and expose yourself to learning new things in grad school, awesome. But Luis is also saying we have to teach people when there should be there has to be some validity, because not all methods are good at answering the same, not good or suited for certain questions. So what advice do you have?
Maybe.
Or do you think?
Maybe. I'm not sure about that. I mean, okay. I'm not sure. Okay. Yes, people do say that sometimes. Like, yes. but I'm not sure that's the right way to think about it. Like, okay. When we think, so there is a frame that you hear sometimes where you want to pick the right method for your question. But, yes. But like, what's the wrong method to study democracy with? Like, what method can't teach us about democracy? I don't think there is. I think that's a wrong way to think. Like, what I think it is that different methods show us different aspects of phenomena. Like, I think that most methods can be useful for most questions, just useful in different ways. That said, and Luis, I think, is absolutely right, and you're right, that there are methods that are within every tradition. There are methods that are deprecated or broken or not useful, right? Like there is, if you're doing a time series, cross-sectional time series analysis, and you're doing a diff analysis, and you have treatments that happen at different points in time, you better not do two-stage fixed or two-way fixed effects, right? We know that. 10 years ago, everyone did that. Now you don't. Like that's a method that still gets published all the time, but shouldn't, right? That's like, that's known. We know that. But every method has things like that. But this is part of the skill of being good at that method, right? It's not that quantitative research is bad and that we debunked quantitative research. It's that we got better at it because we learned that this method doesn't work the way we thought it did. And the same thing happens like with interview research. A wonderful scholar who, Leanne Fuji, has this great book about interview research where she talks about there are ways of talking to people that can lead them to sort of deceive you and lead them not to, and gives examples where people have done, she herself, but also others have done interviews that prime people to be deceptive. And this is a thing that can happen in ethnographic interview research if you establish a relationship in the wrong way. And so it's kind of an understood thing that you shouldn't do those things, right? There are kinds of interview research that work better and kinds that work worse. And we understand that. So within each methodological tradition, there are better and worse approaches. And becoming skilled is part of the process of learning a tradition. But this doesn't mean that you have to like rank order the traditions.
Okay, so I think that was helpful because in Lisa's question was this thing of validity.
Yes.
So, and you want to be clear on your point is more that we have to be careful with that supposition.
Well, see, because I mean, I think when we're thinking about, for example, interpretive research, interpretive research has goals that are valid, and I'm going to use valid in quotes, in a different way than causal inferential research, right? The validity that they're reaching for isn't the same. Like interpretive research maybe wants to present an understanding of how people create meaning, or it wants to make a point about the way that power is being exercised or something. And those are goals that can be valid or invalid in some way. Like you can make a point wrong or you can make it badly, but you're not making a point that's like statistically biased. It's different. It's not the same. And so you know, we don't have the same metrics and same comparisons across these methods.
And then if the validity is different, should those methods be combined to be plural?
I mean, you don't combine them head to head, right?
Okay.
We're not going to do the same things with them. And this is when in the example that I gave today, when I was talking about the motherhood part, the way that the concept of motherhood changed over time, I was doing there an interpretive move. I was looking at the data to try to understand the way that women in the data are constructing the meaning of motherhood. I didn't then go and change the coefficients in the model because of that, right? Those two things are not epistemologically equivalent. But I think our understanding of the subject matter as a whole increases because we do both of them. And that is the goal. It's not that we, you see what I mean?
Yes. I'm just pushing you so
no, of course,
we're very explicit about what you're trying to say.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, great. We are kind of at the end of the questions, but also we're at 7 o'clock and classes start in the evening for some faculty and for students. Okay. So I'm good with this. I'm gonna thank you very, very much. And I think it was a very rich discussion, and we really, really look forward to having you back in Brazil soon. So thank you very much, Jay. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and thank you to everyone for joining us and participating in the conversation and dialogue. And do more methods.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.